Okay, well, I think maybe we can go ahead and get started. It's possible one or two more people might join us in the next couple of minutes, but I think we can sort of get underway. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for joining us today. My name is Luke Holland. I'm the Network Coordinator at Tax Justice Network. We're delighted that you're all able to come along and join us for this webinar today. I wanted to sort of say a special thank you to firstly to Olivia at Eurodad and to Tax Justice Europe for helping us organize all this. As most of you probably know, we actually launched the Financial Secrecy Index last week. So I wanted to also say a huge thank you to everybody who supported the launch. I know a lot of your organizations engaged in media outreach and were promoting it on social media and that kind of thing. And you know, TJN is a small organization. We're not like a sort of one of the amnesties of this world that has a big, you know, global communications machinery that we can throw into action. So the support of all our ally organizations is just absolutely fundamental and makes a huge difference. So it's very, very much appreciated. In a moment, I'll be handing over to Moran Harari, who is the lead researcher on the FSI, who has a much finer mind than mine, and will be explaining a bit about the global findings and the results of this year's FSI. And then Florencia Lorenzo, who's a researcher in TJN's Secrecy team, is going to be speaking more about the results in Europe and what they tell us and about some of the changes that we've seen in some of the indicators for European countries. Florencia also deserves a big thank you because she's joining us from Belo Horizonte in Brazil, where it is horrifically early in the morning. So we appreciate that. At this stage, I mean, well, also I should say, well, obviously we'll have, after the presentations, we'll have some time for Q&A and to discuss and answer questions. We've all been living in Zoom for the past couple of years, so it feels a bit disingenuous to be talking about the Zoom interface, but you'll see the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, so whatever questions you might have, if you could post them there, that would be hugely helpful. It's a little bit easier to pick them up from the Q&A than from the chat, but also do feel free to use the chat if that's more comfortable. And I think that's probably it. You'll be happy to hear from me. So I think with that, I can hand over to Moran, who will take us into talking about some of the meat and the findings of this year's FSI. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining. Thanks, Luke, for introducing us. We're very excited to launch the 7th edition of the Financial Secrecy Index last week. So what we're going to do today is, for those of you who are not familiar with the index, we will introduce it very briefly, just how it works. And then we will introduce the results, some of the results, because we're assessing a lot of countries, some general observations. We will talk about our main methodological changes for the 2022 edition. And then we'll give some highlights of changes. We'll talk about the global focus, the comparison of our ABC of transparency between the recent edition and the last one. And then Florencia will focus on the European highlights, both in terms of changes in the ranking of some countries and also in some of the trends that are worth highlighting. And then some recommendations from us. So For those of you who are not familiar with the index, it's a really great tool for understanding global financial secrecy, illicit financial flows. We have been working at the Tax Justice Network on this since 2009. We publish it every 2 years. So this is, as I said, the 7th edition of the index. We started in 2009 with assessing 60 jurisdictions, and for every edition, we try to increase the number of countries we assess. So for this edition, the 2022 one, we already assessed 141 jurisdictions. The 8 new countries we assessed for this one is American Samoa, Oman, Fiji, Guam, Namibia, Albania, Serbia, and Kosovo. So these are the new countries we introduced this year. The index ranks jurisdiction based on how much financial secrecy they supply to the world. But a higher rank on the index does not necessarily mean that the country is more secrecy, rather that the country plays a bigger role in enabling individuals and entities to hide and to launder their money. So basically the index has 2 components, one qualitative and the other is quantitative. The secrecy score, which is the qualitative one, assesses how secretive is the country's legal framework. And the quantitative component is the global scale weight, which is the country's share in the global financial services that are offered to non-residents. And the combination of these 2 components, according to a specific formula, leads to the secrecy value, according to which we rank the jurisdiction on the index. The reason we take into account the global scale weights and not only assess their legal framework is because we measure the risk for illicit financial flows. And it's clear that large financial centers with relatively moderate financial secrecy, say like Luxembourg, which is ranked 5th, they facilitate more illicit financial flows than small financial centers with high levels of financial secrecy, like the Maldives, for instance. So in our view, the bigger financial center the country has, the more responsibility it has to be financially transparent. And that's why also we think it is worthwhile to focus our advocacy efforts in those countries, because a small change in those countries may lead to more impact around the world. So the secrecy score is comprised of arithmetic average of 20 secrecy indicators divided to 4 thematic areas, as you can see there. They are all scored between 0 and 100. So among those 20 indicators, you can see we look at ownership registration of legal vehicles such as trusts, corporations, foundations. We look at information exchange, court secrecy, international legal cooperation, and more. And we assess each one of those indicators according to the weakest link principle. So what does it mean? It means that the least transparent option available in the jurisdiction will be the one to determine the indicator's secrecy score. So, for example, if a country has several types of companies and only one, for one of them there is no obligation to register legal owners, most likely this country will score badly on this specific indicator. And this is because we assume that those who want to abuse the system will choose to incorporate exactly that excluded type of company. This is some screenshots of media hits that we had for the past week since we launched the index, exactly a week ago. Some of them are really thanks to your efforts for doing some advocacy work in your country. I think especially for Europe, there was a really a lot of media coverage. So that's great. You can see a lot of languages and countries, and we are hoping that we will continue to increase the media coverage in the next few weeks. And this is the world's top 10 suppliers of financial secrecy. So as you can see here, the US now ranks first on our index. It has climbed to the top of the ranking by enabling the biggest supply of financial secrecy ever recorded by the index. And one of the most harmful factors behind this first position is the US refusal to reciprocally exchange information with other countries' tax authorities. Germany this time moved from the 14th position it was in the 2020 edition to being ranked 7th after it increased its supply of financial secrecy by 36%. Singapore leapfrogged from the 5th to the 3rd after it increased its supply of financial secrecy by 14%, while Hong Kong reduced it this time around. And the United Arab Emirates also went up from the 10th position to 8th after increasing its supply of financial secrecy by 7%. The UK is not on the top 10. It ranks 13 this time. But if we add the UK and its overseas territories and crown dependencies together, they all supply just over 10% of all financial secrecy in the world, which is almost double the amount of financial secrecy supplied by the UK. And this is the top 10 in Europe. So not only the European Union, but in a whole Europe. So you can see here that Switzerland, Luxembourg, Germany, and Guernsey are on the top 10. And we have other EU countries like the Netherlands, the UK, Cyprus, and Jersey on the top 20, and 2 are on the top 30. So we have quite a significant number of European countries on the top of our index. And we will dive in more details later on. So some general observation. Overall, the global financial secrecy of the countries we assessed was reduced by 2%. So that actually confirms that the transparency reforms that we are all have been working in the last years are actually working, which is a good sign. The reduction is primarily driven by 2 main trends. The first one is that more countries adopting or improving beneficial ownership registration laws. And the second, that more countries, particularly the lower income ones, improving international cooperation on anti-money laundering, information exchange, and judicial cooperation. So if we compare the jurisdiction performance on the ABC of transparency, which stands for automatic information exchange, beneficial ownership, and country-by-country reporting, we definitely see improvements there compared with the 2020 edition. And we will say some more about that. However, if we look at the 5 countries out of the G7 ones, namely the United States, the UK, Germany, Japan, and Italy, they together have cut back the global progress by half. So all these 5 countries collectively supply 1/8 of all financial secrecy to the world. And what do we mean cut by half is that if we exclude the increase in the financial secrecy from these specific 5 countries, we find that the global financial secrecy actually shrinks by 5% and not by 2%, as I mentioned. Now, we would like to explain some of our main methodological changes that we have applied for this edition. They are not huge, but it's important to highlight them. And there are several reasons why we apply methodological changes. So the first is that for some indicators, we sometimes need to integrate some relevant policy changes to be up to date. Another reason is that part of the indicators overlap with indicators on the corporate tax haven index that we run. And given that we have already applied some methodological changes in the 2021 edition of the corporate tax haven index, we would like to be consistent with this index as well. The third is that there are cases where some of the sources we used for specific questions are no longer available and we don't have the capacity to assess them ourselves. So the first change is on our secrecy indicator number 1 on banking secrecy. We have replaced one of the 6 sub-questions, which the previous question measured whether banks are required to report large transactions to a public authority, and we replaced it with new FATF recommendation 15 on virtual asset providers. On indicator number 9, corporate tax disclosure, we modified the assessment of published tax rulings to make it more robust. That means that although in principle in the past years, I think the level of disclosures on tax ruling has marginally increased, at least in some jurisdiction, we have witnessed the proliferation of the de minimis publication of tax ruling, whereby either not all rulings are published, or if they are published, they are not in their full version. So we have decided to raise the bar for disclosure to be of value for public and for other authorities other than the tax one. On secrecy indicator number 14 on court secrecy, we have eliminated the subcomponent on the openness of court proceeding and simplify the indicator. So it now only focuses on the online availability of judgments on tax matters. And there we assess both criminal and civil judgments. On secrecy indicator number 18 on automatic information exchange, based on the 2020 Global Forum assessments on the jurisdiction compliance with the common reporting standard requirement, we added 2 sub-indicators. The first focuses on the country's compliance with the required legal framework and due diligence procedures, as we call it, core requirement 1. And the second question focuses on whether the jurisdiction network of exchange relationship is compliant with the requirement to enter into agreement with all interested appropriate partners. This is core requirement 2. On secrecy indicator number 19, on information exchange upon request, we now consider the adherence to the amended tax convention by a country as a sole criterion for this indicator. So as a result, countries who are not party to the amended tax convention, they get a full secrecy score, and we no longer assess the number of effective bilateral information exchange relationships they had and calculate the proportional secrecy score in accordance with that. And one more thing about open data. For this index edition, we are no longer analyzing whether a country is publishing information on the ownership and account of legal vehicles and individual in an open data format per se. Among other, the reason we did it is because it was very difficult to determine whether a specific licensing, which hinders the open data access, is in place for each registry. So instead, what we have assessed is whether the information is available in a format which can be easily copied. Another thing we have improved this year is that we developed an automated process to flag potential inconsistencies in the analyzed data. So this process has enabled us to apply a more exhaustive and systemic approach to assess possible interaction both within and across the indicators. And as part of this process, for example, we ensured that countries that do not impose income taxes or alternatively impose only zero income taxes are treated consistently with regards to countries that do impose income taxes but have secretive regulation in place in their income tax system. With regard to consistency between indicator number 12 on consistent personal income taxes and indicator number 13 and promoting tax evasion, we have strengthened our weakest link approach. And for this edition, we are considering temporary personal income tax exemptions. Often they are linked to expatriate regimes as indications for uncomprehensive scope of personal income tax. So as a result, in cases where, for example, country A exempt foreign income of residents expatriates for a period of X years, it will get the highest secrecy score for the comprehensive scope of personal income tax in secrecy indicator number 12. But it will also affect the subcomponent of foreign investment income received by natural person, which we assessed in indicator number 13. Reciprocally, when a jurisdiction provides for exempt treatment of foreign investment income, which is received by natural person in indicator number 13, we consider this as evidence of an incomplete personal income tax in indicator number 12. So these are the main changes we applied in our methodology for this edition. Now, in terms of global trends, if we slightly dive to our ABC, with regards to automatic information exchange, compared with the previous edition, the 2021, there are 5 additional jurisdictions, namely Brunei, Kenya, Morocco, Maldives, and Peru, that have joined the Common Reporting Standard and exchanged bank account information automatically now. Another improvement is that after almost 5 years, we have been calling for countries to publish some statistic on the data they have been exchanging. There are 2 countries, Australia and Germany, that are finally publishing statistic on an aggregate basis. And actually, last week or 10 days ago, I think, Argentina joined these 2 countries and it now publishes this type of statistics as well. But of course, there is always a but. Many low-income countries are still left out and they are not able to join the multilateral convention from various reasons. So we still need to push for inclusivity. And until that happens, it will surely help, we say, if more countries will be a party and at least publish statistics on an aggregate basis so that the countries that are not yet a party to the Common Reporting Standard can use them for analysis and to take action. On beneficial ownership registration, compared with our 2020 edition of the index, in that edition, we identified 80 countries that have beneficial ownership legislation in place. But for this edition, there are already 92 countries that have this legislation, and we do expect this trend to continue to grow, especially in light of the recent FATF reform of Recommendation 24, which, as you know, requires beneficial ownership registration of legal person to be made with an authority. Yet, some of the laws have loopholes, of course, and they are not likely to lead to a sufficient beneficial ownership registration as we'd like them to. Another thing is that the scope of many of these laws is limited, and often it includes only a legal person, but not trust. The triggers, the thresholds, they are also an issue. And finally, I think most beneficial ownership registries are not publicly available yet. On the country-by-country reporting, since if we talk about the public country-by-country reporting, since the 2020 edition, Switzerland joined the countries that require companies operating in the extractive sector to publish their country-by-country reports. Also in 2021, there were 38 countries that published statistics on their implementation of Action 13 of the OECD, which, as you know, requires companies to report on a country-by-country basis, but this is not public. So while these statistics are anonymized and on an aggregate basis as well, they are still useful and constitute a really significant step forward. But we're still in a situation when no country requires full public country by country for all sectors. And here I will hand over to my great colleague, Florencia, Lorenzo, and I will stop share my screen. Florencia, the floor is yours.
Can you see my screen all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Moran. As Moran mentioned, I will dive a bit on the results for the European Union region, but some other European countries as well. So to start, this is the way that EU member states are currently ranking in our index. You can see that almost half of them are ranked below 40, and here in our ranking, the higher you rank, that means you're a bigger provider of financial secrecy. So a higher position in the ranking is a bad indication. And you can see that almost half of them are ranked below 40, which is pretty high. But at the same time, you have some countries which are almost at the bottom of our index, such as Estonia or Slovenia, which indicates what I'll try to show in the next slides, which is a heterogeneous situation in the region. So some countries are implementing really interesting frameworks, while others are still falling behind on some dimensions. And to present like this regional results, I will first go through an overview through the ABCs, but specifically on the European region. And then I'll go through some of the countries that have changed the most since the last edition of our index. I just want to highlight that I won't be able to cover all of the countries. So if there is any country that still you're still interested in or have any doubts, and I'm not able to answer now, please feel free also to reach bilaterally, and I'll do my best to help with any doubts that remain. In the case focusing on Europe in the area of automatic information exchange, as mentioned by Moran previously, in this edition, we included two new variables regarding the implementation of the frameworks to exchange information on an automatic basis, which we are using data from the Global Forum peer reviews. In Europe, these are the countries which have some issue flagged by the Global Forum in the implementation of their AEOI frameworks. Especially in the case of Romania, the Global Forum marks that the country doesn't have a domestic framework in place, which is captured under core component 1. However, even if most countries are already in a context of implementation, with more than 100 activated relationships in place, some of the countries in the region, and here not the EU specifically, but Europe as a whole, have not even signed the multilateral competent authority agreement, such as Montenegro, North Macedonia, Serbia, Ukraine, and Kosovo. Looking at some other variables from our analysis for automatic information exchange, since the previous edition, 2 other countries have signed a pilot project. So Switzerland and UK are now implementing a pilot project, which is basically a project in which a developed country assist a developing country in the implementation of exchange of information in an automated basis. Switzerland is now in a project with Tunisia and the UK with Egypt. And the last point I want to highlight is this discussion, which is an emergent discussion about the uses of common reporting standard information for the purposes of anti-money laundering. Some countries in the region have new evidence or new legislations that some countries are already implementing clauses in their domestic frameworks, which allow the use of common reporting standard information for AML anti-money laundering purposes. So this we consider is somewhat analogous to the Punta del Este Declaration in the Latin American context. Going through beneficial ownership registration, in the same way that I mentioned previously, is not a homogeneous situation in the region. Most countries are actually requiring some type of registration with authorities of beneficial ownership information. Yet there are several loopholes, which mean that currently some of those countries do not have a framework in place which we consider to be sufficient for the purpose of the Financial Secrecy Index. And here we have both loopholes in the framework, but also several countries, which I'll try to highlight later, are having problem in the implementation in terms that they are delayed. And then if we are to highlight the most common loopholes that we verified in our analysis, is several countries still allow for bearer shares, either to be bearer shares are either available or are registered with a custodian and not a public authority, which is not sufficient for the purpose of the establishment of ownership transparency framework. And the other issue we also found is some BO definition, which we consider to be problematic. And when I refer to like problematic definitions, this means some cases in which, for instance, a legal vehicle may be registered instead of a flesh and bone individual. So these are the most common loopholes. But besides those loopholes, there are some countries in the region which still do not have any framework that requires registration with authorities, such as Switzerland, Russia, or Kosovo. And then focusing, the second dimension that we analyze when we talk about beneficial ownership registration is the implementation of transparency, which is captured by indicators 6 and 5 and 2 as well. So if we ignore, so that there's a common trend towards the online availability of beneficial ownership information. And here, if we ignore loopholes or barriers to accessing information, we consider there are currently about 25 countries which are already making information publicly available online. And here I'm not counting only European countries, but countries throughout the world, such as some Latin American countries, as Ecuador, for instance. And there's further 8 jurisdictions which will require some public BO information, but which haven't implemented the framework yet. So we can see this is a trend which is developing, although this is a trend which faces several challenges, especially in the area of accessing BO information. We found that several registers have important challenges, such as the requirement of EIDs in the case of Belgium or Sweden. Some other countries as well have this same issue, or the requirement of copies of the passport to access BO information. There's also issues in terms of the search mechanisms. Some countries do not allow for one to search for the beneficial owner name, but some countries don't even allow for the company name. So you need the company ID, which in some cases is really difficult to find. And yet there are some other positive features that in the trends we verify, which are worth highlighting, such as the fact that some countries are making some ownership information of trust available online, such as Czechia, Denmark, Ecuador, and apparently so will the Netherlands. But there is one of the main areas that we think that improvement needs to be achieved. And here, the European region as a whole has a lot to learn with some developing countries which are at the vanguard of this, which is lowering the thresholds of registration. Currently, most European countries are at the 25% registration threshold. That means that if anyone has, a person only needs to be registered as a beneficial owner if it has 25% or more of shares in a company. And this is very easily to, it's a feature which is very easily to escape. So it's really positive that several developing countries are establishing lower thresholds, such as Argentina with a 0% threshold, Botswana, Colombia, Ecuador. This means when we talk about a 0% threshold, it means if someone has any share, it has to be registered as a beneficial owner. And also Ghana, in the case of politically exposed person, it's also establishing a lower 0 threshold, I think. And then focusing on the country-by-country reporting in the region. So public CBCR is required both for the extractive and the banking sector in all EU countries, but only France is requiring local filing, which means only France is going beyond the OECD in requiring more companies to file information, CBCR information with authorities. And as Moran mentioned earlier, there is this common trend in publishing CBCR statistics, and most countries in the region are publishing CBCR statistics on the non-public CBCR initiative under Action 13 of OECD BEPS project. Yet 10 countries in the region haven't done so, namely Bulgaria, Cyprus, Estonia, Croatia, Lithuania, Malta, Portugal, and Slovakia. Czechia and Hungary were not publishing at the point of data collection, but it appears they now are. So this is a positive improvement for our, in terms of our analysis. And then I'll just go through some of the countries that changed the most, both in terms of improving and worsening. One of the issues that so Norway, since the last edition, went 23 spots in the ranking from 71 to 48, and it worsened its secrecy score in 20%. And there are several reasons behind this change. One of the most relevant ones, which is a trend that I mentioned earlier, is this delay in the implementation of the beneficial ownership framework, which Norway shares with Italy as well. And this impacted secrecy indicators 2, 3, 5, and 6. So it worsened the score of the country in those indicators. Secrecy indicator 2, which relates to the registration of trust information, is also impacted by a loophole in the trigger for trust registration. Now we understand that the law would not require all foreign law trust with a domestic trustee to register. And so this is not sufficient for the purpose of our index. The secrecy indicator 4 on wealth registration was worsened due to evidence of reports being available. And secrecy indicators 5 and 6, which relate to the accounts of partnerships and companies, worsened due to certain revenue-based exemption in the publication of accounts. In Italy, as I mentioned before, there's also this issue with the delay of the beneficial ownership framework. This is one of the key drivers of the worsening the secrecy score of Italy, which went up by almost 9% and led Italy to go up 20 spots in the ranking from 41 to 21. And Italy has also failed to keep up with our more robust assessments in the publication of tax rulings and on the tax treatment of investment income, which, as Moran explained previously, we are now assessing new features regarding the investment income of non-domicile residents. Spain is, it's one of the countries that went the most further up in the ranking. So it went 37 spots up in our ranking from 66 to 29. And this is mainly led by a worsening in its secrecy score of 28%. This is informed by the fact that reports were found to be available. The Secrecy Indicator 9, which relates to company transparency, was worsened due to the strengthening in our assessment in rulings and not changing the legislation regarding local filing of CBCR information. And Secrecy Indicator 12 and 13 were worsened due to a strengthening in our criteria to assess expat regimes, which I mentioned earlier. And so did Secrecy Indicator 14, which was worsened due to the fact that not all judgments are online. And it's a criteria which is getting more weight now. And then in the case of Germany, which is now again in our top 10, it went 7 spots from 14 to 7, with an increase in secrecy by almost 10%. And the deterioration of Germany's position in our index is mainly informed by a deficient implementation of the new transparency laws of the country, which it had passed shortly before. So since the last edition, as we were analyzing the implementation of the beneficial ownership transparency framework, the implementation was considered to be deficient, and this led to a worsening of the score. Specifically, here we highlight the fact that the access condition for Germany's BO register is not considered adequate for the purpose of the Financial Secrecy Index, because it requires that non-resident citizens send a passport picture to access beneficial ownership information, and we consider this to be an undue burden. In addition, Secrecy Indicator 9 worsened due to the change in the assessment of the extractive sector, and also a change in the framework for local filing. And then in terms of some countries in the region which improved, the Netherlands went down 4 spots in our ranking. It's still ranked highly in our ranking. It's in the 12th spot, but it went from the 8th spot to the 12th, so it improved. And here the improvement is mostly in relation to ownership registration. In this edition, we are also analyzing the beneficial ownership registration files. So this impacts the senior manager clause, in that we now consider that the nature of beneficial ownership registration is clearly informed. So if a senior manager was registered, he or she would be registered as such. And also in Secrecy Indicator 16, The Netherlands improved because now it's published in CBCR statistics on an aggregate basis. Poland had a really important improvement in our ranking. It went down 27 spots from 59 to 86. And this is mainly informed by improvement in its secrecy score by 17%. And this is informed both by Secrecy Indicator 2, that foreign law trusts are now required to register, and it's but also Secrecy Indicator 5, because legal and beneficial ownership information are now available online. Secrecy Indicator 7, because we have new evidence from accounts from companies being available online. 11, because which relates to the capacity of the tax administration, because it is now requiring taxpayers to report tax avoidance schemes. Indicator 16 also improved due to the publication of CBCR statistics, and Secrecy Indicator 1 and 17 had slight improvements due to new FATF reviews. Iceland also had an important improvement. It went down 42 spots in the ranking from 84 to 126, and it improved its secrecy score in 26%. This improvement is mainly led by the fact that we found evidence that the senior manager would be registered as such when she or he is registered as a beneficial owner. In Secrecy Indicators 5 and 6, in the components related to ownership transparency, those indicators improve because beneficial and legal ownership information are now available in a good format online. And Secrecy Indicator 9 improves due to the methodological changes in the way we are accessing rulings. So these were the main reasons that Iceland improved in the ranking. Lastly, Latvia was also a country that improved a lot. It went down 30 spots from 65 to 95. So it improved in Secrecy Indicator 3 because there's evidence that the implementation of the beneficial ownership framework is being applied in a consistent way. So companies are being struck off for not registering the beneficial owners. We previously understood that there was some issues in the implementation, and which this new evidence improves the situation of the country. In Secrecy Indicator 5 and 6, improve because beneficial ownership information is now being made available online. The tax administration capacity indicator, Secrecy Indicator 11, also had an improvement because taxpayers are now being obliged to report tax avoidance schemes. And Secrecy Indicator 16 improved due to CBCR statistics. And so this Secrecy Indicator 17 on anti-money laundering and 20 on international legal cooperation due to new assessments of the FATF, which improved the position of the country. So in this context, I think this is like a really brief overview of some of the changes. And that, as I mentioned before, if there's some other countries which you are particularly interested, I'll be glad to try to answer. And then, but what should we, so in the context of our results, we also are presented with the question of what can we do about this scenario of financial opacity or of lack of financial transparency. And here we basically understand that when we talk about anonymous wealth, that is wealth which is not connected to specific flesh and bone individuals, this type of wealth is inevitably lawless, and thus it is important, in our opinion, that countries work towards establishing a global asset register to deliver transparency of ownership of assets and allow laws and taxes to be implemented in a fair and efficient way, in a way that all individuals are subject to the same set of rules. Second, we also have to push towards the establishment of a UN tax convention to set the standards in a globally inclusive way and to create an intergovernmental rule-setting body that can deliver tax rules to end the global tax abuse that costs countries almost $500 billion in lost revenues each year. We consider that there is a lot of momentum to move in this direction. And this was triggered by the UN FACTI panel, which in 2020 called for the establishment of this UN convention, but also because so that there's like several indications that leaders should believe that there is a lot of momentum to move towards this new framework. And just before I head to my final comments, I just want to highlight that when we like to think about the Financial Secrecy Index as much more than a ranking, it is also a set of policy proposals to try to address these issues of financial opacity, which we highlighted in our presentation. So I would like to invite everyone to explore our new website, which is looking really good, in my opinion, which contains several informations about the different components and the explanations about why we assess each country the way we do. But besides that, we also have our methodology available there, which explains each indicator, how we assess. And thanks to a collaboration with our dear partners in TJN Norway, we also have this interactive map, which helps to visualize our results in a more interactive way. So thank you, and I will stop here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Moran, and thank you so much, Florencia. I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A, and if other people have questions that are forming in your mind, please do go ahead and add them there. I think, Moran, Florencia, you can see the questions there from Frederic Strub and Sigrid, our old friend Sigrid. So I'll leave it in your hands to go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much, Flor, and thanks for the question. We'll try to answer them. So the question of Frederic is this one. When you say financial secrecy was increased, for example, in Germany, is this due to a new law? What happened? Who was behind it? Would be interested to understand the politics steps that lead to countries getting worse. And in reverse, there are case studies of countries getting better, and why? Civil society pressure. So thank you for this question. Financial secrecy, when we say financially secrecy supply increase, it can be for main two reasons. Either, as we have two components, so either we talk about the global scale weight, which means that the amount of financial services they provide to non-residents. So if, for example, a country now provides much more financial services to others, that can lead to an increase in the financial secrecy it supplies to the world. Because as we say, the more financial center there is, the more responsibility we expect from the country to take. The other reason can be a change in the legal framework. So for example, if a country now has beneficial ownership registry in place, and it didn't have one for the previous edition in 2020, most likely that the secrecy score will increase and the country will get a lower secrecy score and it will go down the ranking. the efforts of the civil society pressure definitely lead to some of these changes. We have seen the transparency reforms. I think we as a civil society network had a lot of impact in those changes, and our efforts to push for them is, we see now the results as we have provided evidence that in general, the financial secrecy supply is going down, it's shrinking. So that's a good sign. We have a lot of work to do still, but that's a good sign. The other thing I would like to say is that there may be cases where countries have improved their secrecy scores or reduced the financial services they supply, but still they go up the ranking. And that can happen if other countries improved more than they. So if, for instance, we had this with the Cayman Islands this time around, Switzerland has actually shrinked its financial services, but still it went up because Cayman went down. So it is a ranking, and all countries are ranked in proportion to other ones. So that can happen as well. And also, one of the reasons is because we keep on adding new countries. So when other countries add in, the balance sometimes changes. Sigrid, hi, asks if which two countries publish automatic information exchange statistic. Australia is included, Germany as well. And as I mentioned, Argentina has just started to do so 2 weeks ago. So it's not, we have not incorporated in this edition because it happened after we already closed the data, but it will be definitely included for the next time around. Yes, you can have the presentation afterwards, of course. Any other?
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I see we have, there's another question there in the chat from my friend Arnold at Tax Justice Netherlands. What could be our main demands towards our own governments to increase the pressure on the countries at the top of the list? So there's an easy question. What's the policy demands in those contexts? I would imagine it's going to vary a bit from country to country, but depending on where they stand on certain things. But I'll hand over to the people who know, Moran, Florencia.
Yeah, I don't know, Florencia, do you want to take it? I can try and you can add, or
I can answer, and then you can complement. So as I mentioned earlier, we like to think of the FSI not only as a ranking, but as a set of policy asks. So we try to detail as much as possible in our analysis, which is all available on our website, which are the loopholes that need improving in order for the framework to be efficient in guaranteeing financial transparency. So I believe that, as Luke mentioned, it depends a lot from country to country, and that's why it's so valuable that our analyses are all described on our website, because they can be used as a platform of policy asks.
Yeah, exactly. I can add that this is exactly, so the index is definitely a great tool for advocacy work, because the indicators are basically our agenda for a wish list, so to say. We have, though, chose to recommend this time around for the Global Asset Registry, which we don't assess, and to push for UN Convention, because we thought it's a good momentum. We published it just a day before the G7 has convened to discuss on the sanctions of Russian oligarchs. So we thought this is exactly the time to end secrecy and to make the global tax rules more equal. But this is other alternatives. So, and I see that Olivia, thank you so much for pasting this recommendations for the global effort of the network and advocacy work. I see another questions. Why are most countries with FSI are rich countries or in the global north? How about developing countries? That's a very good question. I think one of the reasons why they are ranked on the top is the fact that we in the Financial Secrecy Index are also counting or taking into account the financial services that they supply. So usually those countries are big financial centers for other countries in the world. And that's why, as I said, they have more responsibility and it affects the ranking. Developing countries have also definitely they have responsibility, and sometimes their secrecy or legal framework is more secretive than other, although Florencia has provided some examples, for instance, for countries like Ghana, Botswana, Argentina, developing countries that have like zero thresholds for beneficial ownership registration, which we can take example from. So it's a balance, and we would not like countries like developed countries only to, sometimes they tend to say we are more transparent than developing countries, but this is not the only thing. Because if we take a very tiny country like Vanuatu, that almost no one goes there to put their money in, it may have like a very secretive framework, but even if we make Vanuatu like a 0 secrecy score, the best transparent, what impact will it have on the world secrecy supply? So, yeah.
Okay, and I think there was, in Olivia's 2 points there were a couple of questions there on the kind of how we navigate the opportunities.
I haven't read them.
See that the EU is updating.
Okay. The EU is updating its AML framework, and we have the opportunity to improve. I'll read it. The EU is updating its anti-money laundering framework, and we have the opportunity to improve beneficial ownership transparency. With many improvements needed, what do you see as the highest priority recommendations? Florencia, this one is for you.
I try to highlight a couple of areas which I think are trends or issues that need to be which need to be prioritized in this discussion regarding the AML reform in the EU. But I guess, like, in terms of transparency, like access to beneficial ownership information, but when assessing multiple registers, we found several issues of accessing information. So this should be a priority. So removing the requirements that effectively don't allow civil society organizations, journalists, or investigators to access BO information, such as the EIDs, or like different ways in which the access is hindered, such as also like that the search mechanisms can only be conducted by the ID of the company. This is very problematic. But beyond like the transparency of BO information, we also, in terms of the registration framework, we believe that the definition and the thresholds of the beneficial ownership registration need to be improved significantly. And in this regard, there is evidence that the EU is lagging behind in comparison to developing countries on what is a sufficient threshold. So it adopted the minimum threshold of the FATF as the maximum threshold and this is not sufficient for us because it's really easy to escape. So lowering the threshold is also a big priority in terms of policy asks.
Thank you. And I see there's another, I don't know, to that.
Yeah, there's another one from Olivia.
Yeah, EU member states are transposing the public CBCR directive, which despite its name does not introduce real public CBCR. What key recommendations do you have for improving the EU directive to introduce real public CBCR?
Yeah, well, I think, Olivia, you probably do some more advocacy better than we do in this respect. Yeah, we already have a directive, but basically we think that definitely we need to lower the thresholds for companies that need to publish or to report on a country by country basis. The current threshold is much more, like there are countries where there are only maybe eight companies that are relevant for this reporting standard. And we definitely like to see more sectors that are required to publish the country by country reporting, not only the extractive or the banking sectors, but other sectors are relevant as well. So to extend the scope of the sectors. Meanwhile, I think it's important until that happens and we push for more. That was a long battle, the country by country one, and I think it still is. But meanwhile, until that takes place, I think it's really important to encourage and to push countries to publish their statistics, because these statistics are can be used really usefully by countries that don't have access to this. So if we don't have it published on a specific company level, at least we can have some aggregate numbers we can work with.
Thank you so much. Let's see, we have another nice strategy question from Sigrid there. Let me just read this out. Regarding the previous question on what can national governments do to target the countries at the top of the FSI, it was interesting what you said about Latvia, their non-registering of companies who don't file beneficial ownership information, which is in fact an efficient sanction which targets the most secretive companies and indirectly their home countries perhaps. So, which leads me to another question: are sanctions being assessed as part of the FSI?
Florencia, do you want to take this one?
So the FSI usually doesn't focus on the implementation of the frameworks unless we have some really compelling evidence that the implementation is not being conducted in an efficient manner. And in the case of Latvia, the FATF had previously said that Latvia had really a lot of issues in terms of implementation of the BO framework, in that authorities had not access to access to BO information from most of the companies registered there. But then in this edition, when we were investigating whether the situation changed or not, we found evidence that that companies are being striked off of the register when they don't file BO information. So this for us constituted an evidence that the country is moving toward increasing transparency. That's why we improved the score in registration of BO information. But I'll share in the chat as well the Latvia profile, because I think it's better detailed there.
Yeah, and I will also add, now we have, by the way, on the new website that you're all welcome to see, we have very friendly country profiles that you can really have all the details very easily. But about the sanctions, we do not assess them in the Financial Secrecy Index, but we are hoping to publish something soon. So on sanction, which it will include assessment of sanctions as well, not as part of the index, but as a separate thing. So watch this space.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I don't see any further questions coming up. So if anybody has a little doubt or a question or even a criticism, we'd be willing to hear. In your mind, do shout now. Wait a moment or two. Okay, well, any any takers? Okay, Sigrid just says, thank you for your fantastic work. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Sigrid, for your fantastic. Oh, no, that was Roos. Oh, no, it was Sigrid too. I'm getting confused.
Sigrid,
it was Rose and Sigrid. Everybody, both. Thank you to both of you. I'm going to drop my email address into the chat there in case anybody does think of any doubts or questions that they'd like to ask. And I will, in all likelihood, fail to be able to answer them, but I'll put you in touch with whoever can answer them better. And I guess with that, thank you, Arnold, to you as well. And I guess we can wrap it up there. I don't know, Moran, Florencia, was there anything you wanted to add?
No, we encourage you to use the index as an advocacy tool. I think it can be very useful. Thanks all for your advocacy work and the launch of the index. I think the European coverage was really, really great this time around. And we will send the presentation, the slides, to Olivia, and Olivia will share it with you.
Right.
Yes, and thanks
Thank you
a lot,
so much,
Olivia,
everybody.
for organizing it. And
indeed, thank you, Olivia.
Thank you so much. No work on my part, but I really appreciate the availability and especially structuring all this information so that it's useful for our work. I think it's a really valuable tool. So really, really appreciate the time and presenting it in this way and making yourselves available for us all. Thank you.
Of course, of course. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, and have a lovely rest of your day.
bye.
Bye.